All right, well, let me open us with a word of prayer. Gracious God, what a privilege it is to be able to gather together again in your house, to be able to share food and fellowship, to be able to study your word. Lord, it is always a joy to be gathered together with fellow believers. As we know, the Christian life is not a life designed to live in isolation. It's designed to be lived in community. So we thank you for this community here in Columbia, California. We pray that you continue to bless this church, continue to bless our efforts to reach out to the community. And of course, Lord, we pray that you continue to bless these studies, that you would reveal to us the truth and revelation that we might come to know you better and be better equipped to serve you in the world. Lord, bless the food that we ate. Let it nourish us and strengthen us to continue to live for you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, this week we are on to Revelation 17. We have made our way through the 7 bowls, and now we get to talk about the prostitute. So, we'll be looking at all of Revelation chapter 17 today. Let me start off by reading it. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people and the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." This is the word of the Lord. So, my first question for you this evening is, who is the great prostitute? And what is the meaning and the significance of her description in verses 1 and 2?
I read that it was the world system.
The worldly system? Okay. Absolutely.
In the Old Testament, there was a lot of reference to Israel being, the prostitute in the book of Hosea. The idea is unfaithful. So there's somewhat of a religious commitment, but it's not the real deal.
Somewhat of a religious commitment, but not the real deal. Okay, yeah, absolutely. I think there certainly is a connection in that regard.
I think it's another contrast you see between Christ and the Antichrist, where Christ, the bride, is the church, with the Antichrist, the bride, for all non-believers, and there's this contrast constantly going on in Revelation. And she's called Babylon, mystery, but it's the comparison here is, once again, we see God's work through Christ, and then we see the Antichrist trying to take over and show that he can do what Christ did.
Sure, I think you've really hit on something there, the contrast, right? We see contrast playing out, as you said, throughout Revelation. And certainly you can see that here in that, from the Old Testament and even in Revelation, that God's people are referred to as the bride, and then the non-believers thus being the prostitute. So yeah, the great prostitute, it says explicitly later in the chapter, is to be identified with Babylon, right? But as is often the case in Revelation, I don't think we can leave it simply as the prostitute is Babylon, right? Because I don't think Babylon is referring literally to the city or the empire of Babylon. Instead, I think Babylon is a representative of civilization or mankind apart from God. Or as Margie said, the worldly system, a system of government and civilization that exists apart from God. So I take the prostitute to be representative of all civilizations throughout history who have lived sinful, godless existences. So the prostitute is representative for godless humanity for all intents and purposes. Now, what about as far as her description, right? We're told that she sits by many waters, and the kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. What do you think all that means?
She's in charge of all the unfaithful.
Okay.
Throughout history, there's always been a connection between a religious system and political power.
Sure. Yep. So yeah, I think first of all we have to understand, and we'll get into this later, but later on, the way she's described, in general, we're meant to see her as being outwardly resplendent and even maybe outwardly beautiful, right? But inwardly, she's vile, she's hostile towards God, she's ready at any moment to seduce people away from him. And this idea of a prostitute, or of sexual looseness in general, as was stated a moment ago, was a common idea in the Old Testament. The prostitute, God's people, are viewed as his bride, so when they're unfaithful to him, they are likened to adulterers. So you see this imagery of sexual looseness. Also in the Old Testament, secular and idolatrous world powers, such as Nineveh and Tyre, they're described as being harlots or prostitutes, because they're not God's people, they're not his bride. So by calling Babylon a prostitute here, John is pointing us to the fact that Babylon, i.e. all worldly, godless civilizations, they are secular powers of low moral standards and have committed much evil and seduced people into sharing in that guilt. They've seduced people away from God. John also tells us that the prostitute sits by many waters. Now we're told in verse 15 what that means, as the angel tells us that these waters represent people, multitudes, nations, and languages. Right? So this then is a picture of a powerful worldly empire exercising dominion over many nations that it has conquered and subjected. John then goes on to tell us that the kings of the earth committed adultery with her. Right? Now, because the prostitute is representative of world power, the kings of the earth likely would think that their dealings with this empire were important. They were praiseworthy. We're dealing with these powerful empires. And some kings, as in the case of the Roman Empire, with whom we know John's readers are intimately familiar, some kings even ruled their people as client kings, who were really nothing more than puppets for the Roman authority, right? If you think about Rome, you had the emperor, and then underneath the emperor were all these client kings of all these other nations that didn't really do anything but serve as a puppet for the emperor. Right? You can think about King Herod in the time of Jesus, right? King Herod really had no true authority over the Judeans other than what the emperor and the Roman governor of Judea gave him. So what we see then is that because these kings have such intimate dealings with Babylon, they've joined the prostitute in her sins against God. So Babylon, as the worldly power, is pulling kings away from God into this adultery of the prostitute. John then says that the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Right? So what this means is that the regular, everyday, rank-and-file earth dwellers have been seduced by the prostitute to join in her idolatry with their rulers. So the point of saying this way, the point of saying that the kings of the earth committed adultery with her and the inhabitants of the earth have been intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries, the point is to show that the sinfulness and idolatry of the prostitute has permeated the whole world. Rulers haven't escaped it. Regular people haven't escaped it. This evil, this sinfulness has permeated the world. Now, this is going to be explained, this imagery is going to be explained a little bit in greater detail later in the chapter, so we'll come back to it. But moving on then, verse 3. In verse 3, we see that the woman is sitting on a scarlet beast. And the scarlet beast was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. So what or who is this scarlet beast? And what does its description mean?
Maybe the epitome of evil.
The epitome of evil? Absolutely. The Antichrist?
Whatever it is that's supporting Babylon,
Supporting Babylon? Sure.
whatever it is.
Right. So yeah, if we look at the beast and we look at its description of 7 heads and 10 horns, that should draw up an image in our mind. Because the first beast of chapter 13 was said to have 7 heads and 10 horns. And so I think that this is the same beast. And if you remember our study on chapter 13, we argued that the first beast was likely meant to be a representation of all powers that have persecuted God's people throughout the generations, from Assyria to Babylon to Rome to Nazi Germany to the Antichrist. Right? This first beast is representative of worldly persecution of God's people. So by telling us that the woman is sitting on this beast, John's making an association between the two. He's making an association between the woman and the beast. And the fact that she's sitting on the beast could mean one of two things. One, it could mean that she's an evil power who is in control of the beast, right? Much like if you ride on a horse, you're in control of the horse. That could be one thing. Or it could mean that she's an evil power who is continually supported by the beast. And I tend to think that that interpretation is the better one. The prostitute can't control the beast, because if we take the beast to be what we said from chapter 13, we already learned that that beast is under the authority and control of the dragon, right? And the dragon is Satan. So we already know that this beast is under the control of Satan. So the prostitute is not controlling the beast. Satan is controlling the beast. Also, if we think of the beast as being representative of all world powers who have persecuted Christians, then we can see the woman as being an evil manifestation emanating from these world powers and seducing others to join them. So there's a connection there, and these two are working in concert to lead people away from God. As far as the description of the beast, we talked about it in verse 13, but I'll refresh your memory a little bit. The blasphemous names that it is covered with likely symbolize the fact that these evil, godless world powers, by slandering against and persecuting God's people, are blaspheming against God himself. The fact that the beast is covered with blasphemous names is likely meant to show that the world's blasphemy against God has reached its fullest measure. Blasphemy has covered the world at this point. The scarlet color, the 7 heads, and the 10 horns associate the beast with the dragon of chapter 12, to show not only the great power and authority of the beast, but the fact that the power and authority it has was given it by Satan. Red or scarlet in the Bible is used as a color also for sin. So we see this as a sinful creature that has power and authority given to it by Satan himself. Again, this is an image that will be expanded upon later in the chapter, so we'll come back to it. Moving into verse 4, we see a description of the woman, that she was dressed in purple and scarlet, glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls, held a golden cup filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. What do you think all that means? Deceptive and attractive? Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, purple represents royalty,
Purple represents royalty.
and you said scarlet represents sin.
Scarlet represents sin, but that's what it represents biblically, but scarlet was another color of royalty in society at this time. And the reason why purple, just a little aside here, the reason why purple and scarlet were colors of royalty was because those dyes, purple and red dyes, were hard to get. And so they were super expensive. So only the wealthiest, most powerful people could get it. So yeah, the fact that she's dressed in purple and scarlet, and the fact that she was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls, shows that she's wearing the dress and the adornment of royalty, right? That's only the wealthiest, most powerful people in society could afford purple and scarlet dye and afford gold and precious stones and pearls. But also in this day and age that John's writing in, wearing garments completely of purple was associated with high-class prostitutes. So high class, like the top of the prostitutes of the day, wore purple. And of course, the regular Joes of this day certainly couldn't afford gold, precious stones, and pearls either. So we're meant to see wealth and splendor, right, outwardly. We're then told she had a gold cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. What do you think that means?
And the cup that Jesus had was, the cup of, like, when you take communion and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's the cup of Jesus was the purity,
Mm-hmm.
and then this is contrast. This has a cup too, but it's not.
Sure. It could be a contrast to the cup of the Lord's Supper, absolutely. So, first of all, the golden cup, the fact that it's a golden cup, again, points to the wealth and the extravagance of the prostitute and of the worldly powers that she represents, right? Further, it gives us the expectation that it contains something delicious and satisfying to imbibe, right? What else would such a magnificent chalice contain if not a delicious, luxurious beverage? So you have this expectation that it's going to be something wonderful, but what we see is that the expectation doesn't meet reality, because what's in the golden cup is abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. Now, the phrase abominable things came to be linked in the Old Testament with idolatry. And we know from verses 1 and 2 that her adulteries were leading people into idolatry. So that's the picture here of idolatry. This beautiful cup is yet another way for the prostitute to seduce people away from God. They see this beautiful, resplendent cup, but inside is nothing but adultery and sin and idolatry.
And it's only 20% of them.
Right.
And also represent the blood of Christ as a contrast, and it's the blood of the saints.
It could. I mean, it could. You know, I'm not saying it doesn't. That's not something that really is I've seen really focused upon here, the contrast with the blood of Christ. But certainly with the fact that contrast plays such a large part in Revelation, that certainly could be part of the picture. Absolutely. So anyway, what we see from all of this is that the wealth and splendor of the prostitute is actually an abomination to God, because it's directly linked to her moral and spiritual corruption. It has no substantive value. It's purely a facade to cover the filth inside. So then moving on to chapter 5, we see that the name written on her forehead, which John says was a mystery, is Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. What do you think is the meaning of that name?
Mother concept indicates your public children. So you have one lead source, but you have a lot of false things coming out of it. And different words and so on.
Right. Right, so it indicates that she's created things, children, so to speak, that there's evil emanating from her, so to speak. Okay? Any other thoughts? So first of all, John tells us that this name was a mystery. Because of this, the fact that even John explicitly acknowledged that it's a mystery, we need to be careful how much acrobatics we do in order to try to decipher its meaning. Essentially, though, what we can take the name to mean is that this prostitute, representing Babylon the Great, is the mother of prostitutes and the mother of the abominations of the earth. What that means is she is the preeminent prostitute. She is the preeminent idolater. She is the progenitor of prostitution and idolatry, and therefore, from her springs forth the entire rebellious world. This fits the idea of how the prostitute and the beast upon which she sits are representative of the godless empires around the world. For, think about this: Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, Nazi Germany, the Arab countries in the Middle East right now. What have they done if not lead people into idolatry and rebellion against God? And what will the Antichrist do at the end if not lead people into idolatry and rebellion against God? I think the woman is given the name Babylon because that empire was the greatest persecutor of God's people until the time of the Romans. And it's an example of corruption and persecution from the Old Testament, which Revelation makes heavy use of. So they're taking this worldly, corrupt empire from the Old Testament and putting it forward as the representative for all evil empires who are leading people into idolatry and leading people into rebelliousness from God. So I think that's what the name means for the most part. Now, again, as I said, since John says it's a mystery, we need to understand that it's probably not something we're going to fully understand until God explains it to us one day. But I think that's the idea they're trying to get across here, that Babylon is representative of all godless empires from which basically all evil and corruption in the world emanate. So moving then into verse 6. Verse 6 is quite a vivid image. I see that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. So what do you think it means? What do you think John means when he says the woman was drunk on the blood of God's people? The martyrs? Sure, I think the blood of God's people is the martyrs. But what do you think it means when it says the woman was drunk on the blood of the martyrs?
When you think of being drunk, you think of a confusion, not quite being in the right mind, and the word Babylon came from Babel or confusion. So there's, I think that there are clear statements that this does not really make sense, really.
Okay.
I think sometimes you see people who are drunk, boisterous, reveling in all their own self.
Right. Drunk people are boisterous and reveling in their self. Yeah. So, I mean, I think a couple of things. One, I think it's meant to reinforce in the minds of the readers that the powers this prostitute represents are evil and corrupt and godless, right? So much so that in many cases they are outright hostile to God. They're killing believers. That's the first thing. But second of all, do drunk people enjoy being drunk? Right. I mean, yeah, if you get into alcoholism and stuff, that's a different thing. But when you're in college and you kick back a few beers on the weekend, you enjoyed that, right? Right. So I think it's meant to show how these evil powers enjoy the persecution and destruction of the saints. The prostitute here didn't engage in this persecution because she thought it was a necessary duty, even though she didn't relish it. Like, oh, I've got to kill these Christians. I don't want to, but I feel like I have to. She rejoiced in it. The same way that a college kid rejoices in a bottle of beer. Or a drunkard rejoices in a bottle of wine. And the fact that she was drunk on the blood shows that this wasn't a small amount. Right? You can drink one bottle of beer and be fine. It takes quite a bit to get drunk. And so this shows that this persecution and death of God's people was in mass numbers. It was a lot of blood. Another thing to think here too is that if you look at the original Greek text of Revelation, the word drunk is a present participle. And the reason that's important is because it means the prostitute being drunk on the blood of the saints is a continuing state. It's not a past event, it's an ongoing process. So this is another way that we support our hypothesis that the prostitute and the beast she sits on are meant to represent worldly, godless powers throughout the generations. The persecution of God's people is ongoing. The prostitute continues to be drunk on the blood of the saints. They're still martyrs today, right? A lot of times we don't think about that. We're in America. Yeah, we face some hard times as Christians in America. People don't like us necessarily, but none of us are worried about dying for it. But go to Afghanistan, you're going to be worried about dying for believing in Jesus. You know, that's still a thing. It is. We too often, we get too Americanized in our view of Christianity in this day and age, and we don't realize there are Christians in other countries too that are having completely different experiences than we are. You know, I think that's important, absolutely. So moving then into verse 7. In verse 7, the angel says that he will explain the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides. Who is this angel, and why do you think he agrees to explain these images to John? I'm going to give you a hint. When I ask who is this angel, that's meant to be one of my softball questions. It's supposed to be easy for you to answer. Who is this angel? The angel's just an angel. It's a messenger from God. It's the same angel that came to John in verse 1, and it's the same angel that carried him away in the spirit to a wilderness in verse 3. The angel, whatever angel it is, could be Gabriel, could be Raphael, could be Bill. I don't know. Whatever his name is, he's a messenger from God appointed to show John this vision and explain it to him. So why do you think he agrees to explain these? There's been a lot in Revelation, and not all of it has been explained to John, right? Some of it's been left up to we got to figure it out. But here the angel agrees to explain it to John. Why do you think that is? Because it's important to spread the message? Sure.
To make you aware of what's going on.
To make you aware of what's going on?
About aware of what he's actually seeing.
Aware of what he's seeing? Yeah, I mean, I think that's all valid. All right, we're told that John is greatly astonished by what he has seen. Now, that word in Greek, translated as greatly astonished, actually has a double meaning. And in Greek, it means to be filled with wonder and perplexity. So what we see is that John is perplexed. He's like, I don't understand what's happening here. This is crazy. He's probably freaking out a little bit. Let's be honest. I would be. I saw a prostitute riding a red beast. I'd be freaking out a little bit.
It's
And
not anything that he's used to seeing on earth. All of these images.
right. I mean, this is crazy stuff. These things don't exist on earth. A red beast covered in blasphemy with 7 heads and 10. What on earth? Right? But I also think there's another reason, other than just to help him understand what he's seeing so then he can relay it to, the rest of us through Scripture. We're again supposed to be reminded of the fact that God is still in control. Even over the prostitute, even over the beast, right? By explaining the images, the angels showing John and showing all of us how the prostitute and the beast still have a role to play in God's plan. That even though this stuff you're seeing is crazy, it's okay because it's all part of God's plan. And so then he's providing John with comfort and security rather than astonishment and perplexity.
Why would God ever let this happen?
Right. And we're going to get to at the end of this chapter why God lets it happen. But yeah, I mean, you've got to, I mean, and as we've looked through Revelation, you know, we talk about that John has inserted interludes throughout the narrative of Revelation. And most of the time, why did he do that? Because he knew his readers would have the same reaction he had, like, why on earth is God doing this? What on earth is going on? This is insane. And so he's saying, just God's got a plan. It's all part of it. Trust it, you know. So then moving into verse 8, we get to the explanation of the vision. Verse 8, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. So what does all that mean? See, this is the explanation, right? This is the explanation of the vision. Is it any easier to understand than the vision itself?
John's got to be. This is what happened to Christ.
Right.
And now we're looking at the Antichrist. It's happening. Why? What's going on?
Right. Yeah.
Kind of explains it though, because it points out that there's still only two classes of saints and ain'ts, and the people that are not in the book of life are all in this other category.
Sure, it explains that part, but it still doesn't really explain, and at least not clearly, exactly what the beast who was and is not and yet will come, and like that's not super easy to understand. But what do you guys think it means?
I feel like it's going like one step forward, one step backward, you know, you're just not quite getting it.
Yeah.
I don't know what it means, but it's confusing, I think.
Could it mean that, at one time the devil was loose and free to do what he wanted? And, but he's been locked up now for a while, but he's gonna come back at the end.
Yeah, I mean that could be if you think the fact that the devil is currently locked up.
Not in my house,
But no, I do see what you're saying though, Jim. Yeah, I think you're onto something there, because I think what it really represents is, if you think of the beast being symbolic of evil empires, it shows us the nature of evil, and in some ways the nature of Satan. Right? Evil and sinfulness may seem to disappear, they may seem to die and or be defeated, but they always come back. Right? This is parallel with chapter 13, verse 3, and the fact that one of the heads of the beast had a mortal wound that had been healed. Right? It has a mortal wound. It's been defeated. Well, nope, it healed. It's back. Right? And so I think, we also see a parallel in John's day. We've talked about this a couple times. The commonly held myth that Nero would one day come back to life and lead an army to destroy Rome. So again, you see, it looks like he's dead, but wait, nope, he's back. He's going to kill us all. Right? And some people even looked at the Emperor Domitian, who I argue was the emperor at the time John wrote this. They look at the Emperor Domitian as a sort of second Nero because of his persecution of God's people. So you get this idea that evil is never really dead. It may go away for a while, but it'll always rear its ugly head again until the day that it's finally defeated.
We have to be on the guard all the time, because if we had a victory over a sin, that doesn't mean it's all over.
Right. Absolutely. So we're told then that the beast will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. What do you think that is referencing? When the angel comes and locks the abyss? Sure, that's part of it. Well, it depends on what you take as the beast. I don't think Satan is the beast. I also, I think you also have to take it symbolically. I don't mean I don't think it means that he literally comes out of hell, right? I think it just means he rises again to power. So you could be talking about Satan, you could be talking about the Antichrist, you could be talking about some other worldly power that persecutes Christians. But yes, I think you're right on track in that it's an image of the end times, right? It's an image, and I would argue that the beast in this reference it refers to the final defeat of evil, right? If we take the first beast, as I've said, as being representative of all worldly powers that persecute Christians, what's the final worldly power that's going to persecute Christians? The Antichrist, right? So I see in this that after all of the evil powers and all the evil empires of the world have risen and fallen, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, all of them have risen and fallen. After all that's done, Satan's going to show up one more time with his primary minion, the Antichrist. And they'll establish a truly evil regime along the lines of Babylon and Rome, but this time, God will not put a temporary end to evil's reign of power, as he's done previously. This time, he'll finally bring sin and evil to an end once and for all. It will be destruction. The inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, right? We've seen this image throughout Revelation as well, where what the beast does, what the beast is capable of, be it the first beast or the second beast, the people who don't know God are amazed by it. They see these signs and wonders and think, oh, this beast is worthy of worship. So we see it again, right? The people who don't know Jesus will be duped by the beast. We saw it in chapter 13. We're seeing again. They'll be led away from God and into the idolatry and godlessness of the worldly empires. So I think that's what you see here. We're seeing this idea that throughout history, the beast, evil, sinful powers in the world have risen and fallen. But the time's going to come when one final one will rise up, and then that's when God's going to say is enough. Enough is enough. And he's going to bring it all to an end. So then we move on in verses 9 to 11 to talk about the heads. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. So again, we have an explanation of what the 7 heads mean that's about as clear as week old mud. So what do you think that means?
Well, first of all, it calls for a mind with wisdom. And that means no opinions.
Right. Sure, yeah. I think... again, I think we see it in that statement, this calls for a mind with wisdom, that Revelation is supposed to be hard to understand. It is. Not that it can't be understood or not that it doesn't have value, but it's supposed to be difficult.
I think the image of the 7 kings is another throwback to even Nero and Rome and the 7 hills of Rome and the 7 kings. They're thinking what was happening there. Another contrast, another image. A lot of people feel that at this time, the world powers, these kings, will bring in a world religion. And they take over and bring all these people, all these unsaved people, through their own religion and their own kingdoms, and bring them on up. And just they're evil personified. It gets worse and worse and worse. And they've worked for, at this point, Babylon, if you will, and the Antichrist, then it's just getting worse.
Yeah, it's getting worse. Right. No, I think you're on something there. And yeah, you're right when you draw a comparison with Rome, right? The 7 hills of the city of Rome are mentioned frequently in ancient literature. So it shows the woman. But I think the fact that it says 7 hills here shows that the woman is not supposed to be identified solely with Babylon, right? She's called Babylon, but then she's associated with the seven hills of Rome. So that again gives us this idea that she's representative of multiple things, not just Babylon, right?
This is the second time that they hear the wisdom. Remember back when we were at Revelation 13, verse 18, here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, 666.
Right.
It's also a little bit hard to grasp.
Sure. Yeah, we spent a good portion on 666 a few weeks ago. I think you're right. But I don't think the association with Rome is the end of the meaning of the seven heads, right? The woman, as we have said, is representative of all worldly, godless cities and empires. So when we look at the woman, we could think of her as being representative of no city and every city at the same time. Right? She represents mankind apart from God, who always has and always will oppose the people of God in every age. 7, as we know, and we've talked about many times, is a scriptural number for completeness. So the 7 hills also are likely a representation of the fact that this woman is to be associated with the totality of evil humanity throughout the generations. We're told, though, that the 7 heads are also 7 kings. And then we get an interesting description of these 7 kings. 5 have fallen, they have died and are no more. 1 is, which means it is present and active, and 1 is yet to come, but will only remain for a little while. So what do you think those 7 kings represent?
If your history buff, you can think of some big names that have done an awful lot of damage and been very, very evil.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, literally speaking, there's been plenty of people throughout history that could be those 7 kings that have done a lot of bad things. Any other thoughts? So there are 3 major interpretations of what the 7 kings in their description are. One interpretation that these 7 kings refer to Roman rulers, which, depending on when you date the book, these rulers could include some combination of Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, Nerva, and Trajan. So, how do you know what 7? If that's the fact that they're referring to 7 rulers of Rome, how do you determine which 7 they're talking about? So, as you might have guessed, I don't think this is the correct interpretation. I believe Rome does play a large part in Revelation, but I also think this is about, and all of Revelation is about so much more than just Rome, right? The strict preterist views Revelation to just be about Rome, and I don't think that's the case. Another interpretation of these 7 kings is that it refers to empires rather than individual kings. This interpretation places the 5 fallen empires as the Old Babylonian Empire, Assyrian Empire, New Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, and Greco-Macedonian Empire. Those are the 5 that have fallen. The present active empire, because it was what was active in John's day, would have been the Roman Empire. And then the future empire is placed as all anti-Christian governments from the time of the Roman Empire to the coming of the Antichrist. Now, this interpretation makes more sense from an eclectic point of view because it certainly brings in the entirety of human history into the view of this vision. But I still think it's missing the point because to just say the 7th empire represents everything from the Roman Empire to the Antichrist, it doesn't fit with how they're trying to lay it out with the empires. So I'm going to go a little even more eclectic on you and say that I tend to side with the interpretation that the 7 here is meant to be taken how? Not literally, symbolically, right? And I think it's meant to be used as it's used often in Revelation, right? 7 is used in Revelation and in many other Jewish writings symbolically to refer to world empires. And as we've stated many, many times, it's the number of perfection and completion. So we could take the 7 kings here to be symbolic of world kingdoms that are complete. The number 7 then would be a symbolic reference to the fact that all world powers are only temporary and are precursors to the 8th ruler that we see in verse 11. So I take it to generally mean, again, I think we try too hard when we try to cram things into Revelation. The beast, as we learn, is the eighth ruler who belongs to the seven and is going to his destruction. What or who do you think is this eighth ruler? Antichrist? Okay. Any other thoughts? Do we all agree that we think it's the Antichrist? Something very bad, right? So yeah, the two main schools of thought that you find about the eighth beast is the folks who see the seven kings as being Roman rulers place the eighth king also as being a Roman ruler. Many point to Domitian, who was an emperor like Nero, as I said a moment ago, for his persecution of Christians. But those who take the seven kings to be empires see this as a reference to the empire ruled by the Antichrist at the end of days. And if you view it symbolically as I do, it leaves it a little more open to interpretation, just what you think the eighth ruler might be. And I think, considering my argument that the beast who will come out of the abyss but go to its destruction in verse 8 was referring to the Antichrist, I tend to think that the eighth king is also a reference to the Antichrist, who will establish an empire at the end of days before he is ultimately defeated by Christ. So what we see then is this image of evil empires, as I said, temporarily rising and falling. But they're all precursors, they're all foreshadowing, they're all a telescope looking at the final, capital A, Antichrist, and what he establishes at the end of days. So moving into verses 12 to 14, we look at the angel's description of the 10 horns. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. What do you think that means? Not yet received a kingdom, but for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. A little bit of time? Sure.
It's kind of like the final armies that are gathering for the Battle of Armageddon.
Sure, yeah, the final armies that are gathering for the Battle of Armageddon. So yeah, some argue that these 10 kings also refer to 10 Roman rulers. The people who think Revelation is all about Rome, man, they just stick to Rome. And they argue that these 10 kings are also Roman rulers. But this ignores the fact that John tells us they haven't yet received a kingdom. If they were 10 Roman rulers, they would have already received the kingdom. Others argue that it refers to rulers from the east who will help the returned Nero defeat Rome. Right? That was more common in John's day, obviously. Others argue that they're Rome's client kingdoms who serve under Roman authority. Others see them as being 10 rulers that are given power by the beast and therefore by Satan at the end of days. They say these 10 might be actual rulers or they might be demonic figures, but the point is they're given their power to assist Satan and to assist the Antichrist. And I tend to agree more with this perspective because we're told in the succeeding verses that they will wage war against the Lamb. And I think that points to the final battle between good and evil. Certainly you could make an argument that other evil empires throughout history have waged war against Jesus. But I don't think you would reference the persecution of Christians as those empires waging war against the Lamb. I think by saying they waged war against the Lamb points to when they actually wage war against the Lamb at the end of days. The number 10 might be literal. It might be literally 10 rulers that do this, or it might be symbolic, right? Saying that the number of helpers will be complete. The totality of the number of helpers is going to come to assist the Antichrist. We're also told these 10 kings will be given power for 1 hour. As John said, it's going to be a short time. Now, does that mean it's going to be a short time for us or a short time for God? We don't know. A short time for God is a lot longer than a short time for us. So it could be either one, but either way we can understand that their authority is only temporary. We're further told that they receive authority along with the beast. Their authority is not intrinsic, right? They're given it in the same way that the beast is given it, meaning that they're given their authority by Satan because God allowed him to give it to them.
I think that's when John's jaw drops.
Probably. Probably so. We're then told, though, that they have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. What do you think that means? They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast.
Evil tends to unite against God. When Jesus was crucified, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who were bitter enemies, combined to attack.
Okay.
I think we want to see people from different aspects coming together.
Sure. No, I think you're right. I think you're right on track with that evil has a tendency to kind of come together to oppose that which is good and godly, right? It means that these 10 rulers and the beast, they're all in agreement. They're all in one accord. That they'll give their power and their authority to the beast, meaning they'll follow the beast wholeheartedly. They'll give him all of the help and the support that they possibly can. They relinquish any autonomy that they might have in order to present a strong, united front with the beast. But we're told, even in spite of this strong, united front against the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Right? This is the one purpose the angel was speaking of in verse 13. The one purpose of these 10 was to wage war with Jesus. So I think here, as John said, we have the final battle between good and evil. We have Armageddon. However, the beast and his minions, we see, stand no chance against the power and majesty of the Lamb. They will be defeated by the victorious Lamb, and he will prove once and for all that he, not the Antichrist, not the beast, not the dragon, he is truly the King of kings and the Lord of lords. And we have the promise here in this verse that we, Jesus' called, chosen, and faithful followers, will be with him. Now, when it says we'll be with him, does it mean we'll be with him in the battle, or we'll be with him in victory? What do you think it means? In victory? Okay, and I tend to agree with that. Because I always pictured in the Battle of Armageddon that all evil forces would line up, and then Jesus and the angels and all of the saints would line up on the other side, like you see in those Revolutionary War movies, and we just start pointing our muskets at each other and shooting each other. But then I got to thinking, does Jesus really need our help? I don't think he does. I think on one side you're going to have Satan and demons and Antichrist and everything, and the other side is just going to be Jesus, like, what's up? Let's do this. I don't know that we're going to have a part really to play in the war in that way, because I don't think Jesus needs our help. But what I can guarantee you is that we will be with him in his victory. That his victory and the rewards of the new heaven, the new earth, we will get to share with him. And so we see that here in this verse. Moving into verse 15, the angel says, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." What do you think that means? The whole earth? Right, I think it's meant to show just how far the seduction and influence of the prostitute has reached. She didn't just lead a few people away from God and into rebelliousness. She didn't even lead just a few nations away from God and into rebelliousness and idolatry. She led multitudes. She has a vast and expansive empire over which she is able to exert influence and control. But we learn that in verse 16 that the beast and the 10 horns decided, you know what, we hate this prostitute. They bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They'll eat her flesh and burn her with fire. What do you think that means when it says that the beast and the horns will hate the prostitute, and then what they're going to do to her? Evil will always be evil? Right, I think that's right on track, right? Evil, when it's all said and done, can't present itself as a united front, right? Being evil, the parties will eventually give in to their own desires, their own whims, their own ideas. They'll become jealous and suspicious. They'll turn on one another. I think about it like the mob, right? Mafia. You watch those movies and you read about the mafia. They never operated in peace and harmony. One of them was always going behind the other one's back. One of them was always dealing drugs. They were always killing each other, right? evil will always be evil. Eventually their most base evil desires will take over and they'll devour each other. Right?
She served her purpose as being attractive, and that's all it is, so they don't need her anymore.
She served her purpose of being attractive, and so they don't need her anymore? Yeah, I think that's part of it. And what the angel says the beast and the horns do to the woman is also an Old Testament allusion. The imagery of that is built upon the destruction of apostate Jerusalem in Ezekiel 23, 25 to 29. When they say they strip her naked, it means they'll strip her of every resource and expose her sinful deeds. To devour her flesh means they will prey on her and consume her, figuratively, of course, right? It's an image of terrible judgment. It's also from Ezekiel 23, and it shows that the woman will be destroyed. To consume her with fire is an image of her being destroyed not only in the fires of conquest, but also in the eternal torment of the lake of fire. According to Leviticus 21:9, a priest's daughter who became a prostitute was to be burned with fire. So this could be an allusion to that as well. So we see that basically they've given in to their most base mentalities here, and they've turned on each other. And there's like a civil war going on amongst the powers of evil. But what makes it interesting is when we move into verse 17. In verse 17, it says, God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. Why would God put it in the hearts of the beast and the horns to do this to the woman? And why would he agree to give them authority? Right, ultimately he's absolutely in control. Let him try. Sure.
Maybe for some to see what evil is doing.
Okay, yeah, so some could see. I mean, because it says strip her naked. They're going to expose her sins. That could certainly be some of it, sure.
Would this also be the city of Babylon?
It could be. Certainly people would argue that point. But I think ultimately why it says this, why God put it in their hearts, why he gave them authority, is because his will needed to be accomplished. Right? The woman needed to face judgment and punishment for what she had done, and God, in his sovereign will, chose to enact that judgment and that punishment through the beast and the horns. He gives them the power and authority to attack the woman so his will would be done. Though the beast and the horns thought they were accomplishing their own evil goals, right? As you said, she's not beautiful. They have no reason for her anymore, so they attack her. They thought they were accomplishing their own goals. They were actually being used by God to accomplish his purposes. They will actually be helping assist God in fulfilling the promises he's made from the very beginning, that he would bring judgment and punishment to all those who oppose him and his people. So they're being used by God as tools to accomplish his purpose in judging and punishing the prostitute. Then finally in verse 18, it says, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the king of the earth. So who or what is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth? What's that? Babylon? So for John and his original readers, the great city that rules over the kings of the earth would have been what? Rome. That rules over the kings of the earth. Right? So in John's day, that was Rome. Rome was the biggest, baddest thing on the block. It ruled over the kings of the earth. However, taking an eclectic approach to Revelation, I think we need to understand it as referencing Rome as a foreshadowing, a telescope looking at godless, sinful humanity at the end of days. Right? This, as we've talked about, I talked about it in Daniel, I've talked about it in Revelation. Apocalyptic literature, what it generally did was it looked at current events and used those current events as a telescope to look through them to future events. And so I think the great city that rules over the kings of the earth, certainly for John's readers, would have been Rome. But then you telescope that through to the end of the days when the Antichrist has control over a large portion of the earth. So to wrap up here, my last two questions are always what my last two questions are. What message should we, Christ Church, take away from chapter 17? God is in control? Absolutely.
Get your name in the Lamb's Book of Life.
Get your name in the Lamb's Book of Life. Okay, that's a good one.
That evil is still all around us.
Evil is still all around us? Absolutely. So I think, as always, two lessons that we need to take away, as we do from pretty much every chapter in Revelation. First is the need for absolute fidelity and loyalty to Christ. Right? God is going to judge and punish the wicked. And so we need to make sure that we are unwavering in our devotion to him. But also, because he's going to judge and punish the wicked, what should that do? It means we should live for him now. Right? We should be disciples and evangelists, sharing the gospel and showing the love of Jesus so that others might come to know him and avoid the punishment that befalls the prostitute. But third, I think it teaches us that we should rest in the absolute confidence that Christ is going to win. Right? We need not fear or worry or panic when things get bad. We need to hold fast to the fact, as we see in verse 17, that Christ has already won the victory. And then fourth, on a little bit more of a practical, tangible level, I think it reminds us of the importance of interpreting and examining Revelation, and naturally interpreting and examining Scripture as a whole on its own terms, rather than trying to read modern events or circumstances into it. Right? This chapter is one that lends itself to trying to interpret it through a modern lens. Who from modern society is the prostitute? Well, who from modern society is the Antichrist? Is Barack Obama the Antichrist? Is Donald Trump the Antichrist? Right? We go through that. What world political figure will do these things? Is there going to be a literal revival of Babylon or the Roman Empire? And if so, what current world power will enact that revival? Is the coronavirus vaccine the mark of the beast? Right? We get into doing these kind of things and trying to read our current events into Revelation, when we need to understand that Revelation and the rest of Scripture is meant to have a meaning and importance for every Christian from every age. Every generation has done this with Revelation. Do you realize that? Every generation has read their current events into the book of Revelation. And so far, they've all been wrong. So I think it might be safe to say that we also would be wrong if we did that. So we need to understand that rather than forcing our current events and circumstances into the symbol of Revelation, we need to look for the universal truths present in Revelation and apply them to our lives. And then lastly, I didn't change it. When you get the outline, it's going to say, how does chapter 16 reinforce the main theme? That should be chapter 17. How does chapter 17 reinforce the main theme of Revelation, that God is in control and he will win?
God is very much in control.
God is very much in control. Okay, yep. So I think first, the fact that we're told explicitly in verse 8 that the beast will rise from the abyss and then immediately go to its destruction, that shows that God will win, right? He's going to destroy the beast. Second, we're also told explicitly in verse 11 that the Lamb will triumph over the beast and the 10 horns when they wage war against him. Another overt statement that God is going to win. Third, the fact that the angel is right there. He's ready. As soon as John is perplexed, the angel's ready with an interpretation of the vision. That shows God's in control, right? The angel knew what all the events of the vision meant because they were all under God's control and unfolding according to his plan. And then fourth, verse 17, and the fact that God used the beast and the 10 horns to accomplish his purpose shows that he's in control, right? They thought they were doing this, destroying the prostitute for themselves. They thought they were accomplishing their own purposes, but what they were doing was actually accomplishing God's purposes. He was using them for his plan because he is the one that's in control. What's that? Wow, right. I mean, it gives us a good idea about just really how in control God is, right? I mean, even not even just over the events of the end, but period. You think you did something because you wanted to. Well, God, maybe God was using that for something else you didn't even realize. Oh, I decided to go to Walmart instead of Safeway today. Oh, no big deal. I just felt like going to Walmart instead. It's a little bit cheaper. Oh, but then I have an opportunity to tell the cashier about Jesus. You don't think God made you decide to go to Walmart instead of Safeway that day? Just things like that. It's interesting to think about. So anyway, any other thoughts or comments or anything?
I think one of the things that I mentioned this earlier to you, I think this really demonstrates so convincingly why Revelation is hard to understand. Sometimes we see events described in Revelation, so, okay, it's over, it's done, there's no more. And then you come another chapter, you see it go a little farther. Well, I thought we were done here, now we're seeing it here. And we're getting these different perspectives. And John is seeing this from different people. He writes it, and we look at it from our perspective. It's very confusing. It's a past, present, and future. No matter where you're at, it's past, present, and future. Now, how far did you go in the future? Or how far did you go in the past? So it makes it kind of hard to understand. But what's really, really understandable in it is what our role is supposed to be during this time. And that's just what you just said.
Right, absolutely. And I think, it is. And as I shared with you when you shared that with me, as soon as you realize that John didn't write the narrative of Revelation chronologically, it opens up the ability to understand it quite a bit, I think. I didn't realize until we were doing this study that I always assumed it was, there was the 7 seals. And then there was the 7 trumpets. And then there was the 7 bowls. No, I didn't realize those things overlapped, that they were all kind of going on at the same time. And when you realize that, it kind of starts to make pieces fall into place in how you're able to understand Revelation. So absolutely. Anything else? Anybody want to volunteer to close us in prayer?
Dear Lord, we thank you that you have shown us, even though it's a tough ride, we stay with you, we win. We thank you for the ability to study together in the light of freedom. And we thank you and ask you to be with us as we go out and share with our neighbors the good news. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.